From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden and President Trump make dueling trips to Texas and the U.S. Mexico border as they each try to frame the immigration issue for the 2024 election. Plus, Congress again averts a government shutdown, but only by kicking the deadline into March. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague, editorial board member Kate Batchelder Odell. Happy Friday to you, Kate.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
So the news this week from Gallup polling is immigration surges to top of most important problem list, the first time that has been the case since 2019. 28% of Americans now say that immigration is the most important problem facing the country. Number two is government. And by the way, I love that the polling question just asked, what's the most important problem? And one of the choices is the government. But that's number two. Then the economy with 12% and inflation with 11%. But don't say that our political leaders are not responsive, because on Thursday, President Trump was in Eagle Pass, Texas, and President Biden was in Brownsville, Texas. Let's listen to clips of a bit of what each of them said. Here is first President Trump.
We had catch and release in Mexico. We had catch before that. It was catch and release a criminal, and they released him in the United States. We had no more catch and release. Our catch and release was we released him in Mexico. And if you broke the law, we caught you, we deported you, or we did something else. But we were doing a great job, and that's where it stood. And then we had an election.
And here is President Biden.
I understand my predecessors in Eagle Pass today. So here's what I would say to Mr. Trump. Instead of playing politics with this issue, instead of telling members of Congress to block this legislation, join me, or I'll join you in telling the Congress to pass this bipartisan border security bill. We can do it together. You know and I know it's the toughest, most efficient, most effective border security bill this country has ever seen. So instead of playing politics with the issue, why don't we just get together and get it done?
An interesting contrast there 8 months out from the election. Kate, what do you make of the framing that each of them are taking? I got a kick a little bit out of President Biden saying, join me or I'll join you, as if 8 months before voters go to pick the next president, we're going to see the two of them marching up to Capitol Hill hand in hand to try to get this bill passed.
I mean, I think Biden going to the border at all right now is in some sense a concession to political reality in those polls that you just mentioned, where this issue has really overtaken a lot of others, including the economy, which nobody seems to think is particularly sparkling right now, besides the Biden administration, who's been trying to pitch that. So I think this is a concession to that reality, but just by him going there. And it's an issue where Trump has some remaining credibility with at least some subsection of Republican primary voters, because whatever you think about his policy and his rhetoric about it, it's been his defining issue for years. So I think voters are more likely to take Trump seriously at the border than they are Biden, who's going down there after having been in charge for several years now and seems to be only belatedly discovering that there's a real problem both on the merits and the politics. But that said, you really have to hand it to Trump in his ability to make unforced errors, because the bipartisan border bill that came through Congress, Biden now gets to lean on President Trump having killed that and having scared Republicans away from it. So it really bought him something of an out on one of his most vulnerable issues.
It will be interesting to see how much Biden is able to use that in the coming election. But I generally agree with what you've said there. And it was notable to me, President Trump was at the border again in Eagle Pass. He was talking about the Remain in Mexico policy that Biden rescinded. And fair enough, I think that's fine political territory, but you can't just wave a magic wand and bring Remain in Mexico back. You have to get the agreement of the government of Mexico, which might not be inclined to go along with this any longer. And in any event, the Remain in Mexico policy was kind of exporting problems with the U.S. asylum system instead of fixing them. And one of the advantages of this bill that was negotiated in the Senate by James Lankford from Oklahoma was actually raising the bar for claiming asylum and getting into that system in the first place. So it had some provisions that were trying to clean up the problem at the root of it. And I did not hear any real proposals from President Trump at the border about how he intends to try to deal with this crisis and what can be done in the short term. He spent a lot of time lauding Texas for the steps that it has taken to step into the breach, as it were. Texas Governor Greg Abbott was there with him. But notable that on the same day they were at the border, a federal judge in Austin issued a ruling blocking for now a Texas law that had been passed in order to help Texas enforce immigration rules in the stead of the federal government. And so there was a Texas law called SB 4. It has a provision creating a state crime for non-citizens to cross the border into Texas. And then it would allow state judges to issue orders that require people to exit the country. And one of the things that Texas had used to justify this was the provision in the U.S. Constitution that says that states have a right of self-defense if they are, quote unquote, invaded. And here is the response from federal Judge David Ezra. He says, first, the Supremacy Clause and Supreme Court precedent affirm that states may not exercise immigration power. Second, SB 4 conflicts with key provisions of federal immigration law. Third, surges in immigration do not constitute an invasion. And then he says to allow Texas to supersede federal directives would amount to nullification of federal law and authority, a notion that is antithetical to the Constitution and has been unequivocally rejected by federal courts since the Civil War. And so a pretty sweeping order there blocking enforcement of the Texas law. And so, Kate, the way that I read that is President Trump is going down to the border and he's lauding Governor Greg Abbott for taking steps to try to stop migration. And some of those steps, I should say, are probably not blocked by this order, including Texas's efforts to set up razor wire and so forth in places that are frequently crossed. But I'm still looking for a solution other than saying, Congress, you write immigration law, do your job.
Right. I mean, I think you're right to really zero in on the asylum standards and how they need to be changed. And keep in mind, when President Trump was in office, he suggested in a speech that Congress really needed to fix these standards because right now, someone can come to the border, claim asylum, and because there's such a backlog in cases, they can be released into the interior for years and years before their hearing. And so to the point about border security and putting up razor wire, well, even if you built a full Donald Trump wall, that is only so helpful if you can walk up to a border guard and claim asylum. So you need to strengthen these standards so that you try to ferret out more quickly who the legitimate asylum claims are. And the bipartisan border bill really did make an attempt to do that. For instance, in these initial screenings, finding out things like, could you have moved to a different part of your own country as opposed to coming to the United States and been safe from persecution there? So that is what has to be fixed, or otherwise we're going to continue to see these scenes at the border. I mean, keep in mind, Trump did do some other things at the border other than this, but there was chaos under his term as well. And so you need to fix the underlying incentives if you want to change it. And again, on the Texas issue, obviously there's a tremendous amount of sympathy for Governor Abbott and what he's trying to deal with down there at the border, which he's had very little help from the Biden administration. But at the same time, wading into trying to preempt federal immigration laws, I think, was a mistake. So you do need really, like you said, an action from Congress to deal with the problem. But yet, as it becomes more obvious that we need that, it's becoming further and further out of reach for lawmakers to actually get done.